You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
This episode of CEO Perspectives was recorded on February 23rd, 2022. Enjoy.
We are in the midst of a very critical time in world history, and history is being made as we speak. What we're going to cover today will be some of the critical questions and issues around Russia and their incursion into Ukraine, what happens with that, how NATO is involved with that, and what happens with China as a result of all of this. So now let me introduce our guest today. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, but with me is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, whom most of you know is the president of the Committee for Economic Development, which is the public policy center of the Conference Board. Lori brings to CED an extensive experience at the highest echelons of domestic and international policy. Lori, I know that always embarrasses you when I talk about your full range of experiences, but you are an expert in all of this, and I can't think of anyone better to engage with today to help bring some insights to the state of the world. So thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you. They're always very lively, so very much looking forward to it.
So, Lori, we have to start with Russia and Ukraine. Russia began what the U.S. administration called an invasion yesterday. They said that the start of the invasion began yesterday. To students of Ukraine, this was not a surprise. Yesterday was Tuesday, TWO, 2/22/22, Tuesday. But it also the anniversary of the date that former pro-Russia President Viktor Yanukovych was ousted from office in the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014. I'm not sure people know that, but that was 2/22/14. So there was a little bit of serendipity to the date yesterday. He, of course, is currently in exile in Russia. So, Lori, the world is sitting on edge here. What is Russia's intent in Ukraine? What does Russia want?
Very fortunate about Putin. He's very transparent about his intentions, and he has been since 2000. His overall strategic intention is to bring back the greatness of the Soviet Empire, the greatness of Russia. That's his overall strategic intention that has been driving him. And Ukraine is such a critical piece of that. It is because Ukraine became independent with the fall of the Soviet Union that really played a very large role in the loss of Moscow, Russia's global standing. And that's because Ukraine, in terms of the republics, is the second largest republic, the most populous. It was most highly industrialized. It was also the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and of Russia. And it was its buffer zone from the rest of Europe. And, as many of our listeners know, that is where there were over 1,900 strategic nuclear weapons actually were in Ukraine. It's very important in terms of its mapping, its geography, and also in terms of its economy. It has been important to Soviet leaders throughout its history, and as Putin has noted, and Putin really he has been very consistent in how he has delegitimized Ukraine as a state, as an independent state, and it has always been and goes back very far in terms of ancient history, part of Russia. So he's very clear how he sees Ukraine. His number one top goal is really focused on, I would say, top priority would be to actually reincorporate Ukraine back into Russia. He's been very clear about that. He might settle for a government in Kyiv that basically acknowledges Russia's hegemony. But looking at it today, in terms of why it's important as well, is that a third of Russian gas actually flows through Ukraine. And that's why Nord Stream 2 was so important to Putin, which we'll get to, I'm sure, later in terms of talking about the sanctions. But a third of Russian gas currently flows through Ukraine. So it's actually critical for one of its most important and major exports. But I also want to add, though, that I think that's the focus. I think that's the heart and soul of what he's doing, the importance of Ukraine. But of course, there are other strategic goals that he gains. And one is from his aggressive behavior towards Ukraine. And one is clearly splitting NATO. NATO, he sees NATO as expanding, its expansion as being a threat to Russia's national security, its integrity, and especially after experiencing 2014, where the reaction was more de minimis to his annexation of Crimea. I think he really sees this as an opportunity to really put NATO on the line and actually split NATO. And similarly, on the economic front, cause as much disruption in terms of the EU, which is, since we're talking about 2014, that is exactly what triggered the conflict in Ukraine, was when Yanukovych wanted to not join the EU, and that's what started the Maidan protests.
Ukraine has been independent and overrun throughout its 50,000 year history, and so it's being part of Russia and the USSR is actually a very recent phenomenon. So that bears going through.
Yes, and I just add to that, Steve. What's so important about that history is the way the Ukrainian national identity, cultural identity, has survived all of that, and it just gives you real insight into how strong a sense of being Ukrainian is among the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians as a people predated Russia and the Russians, but that's kind of neither here nor there. But just to set the human record straight. So, Lori, Russia has demanded that Ukraine turn over all weapons to them and demilitarize. That was one of the demands that came out yesterday. Does that seem likely, or do you think there's going to be a broad-scale kinetic war?
So we're all waiting. The world is waiting to see what Putin does. And I'm sure he's doing his real-time assessments of the reactions that have happened since he has declared the independence of those areas in Ukraine and recognized their independence. So the world is on edge, waiting to see what his next move is, while they're taking actions, obviously the sanctions actions, the movement of U.S. troops, and the rallying of the international community against what Putin has done. And just about every nation except for China has actually condemned what Putin has done globally, and the UN is meeting today. But whether there'll be a kinetic war or not really sits, in the Kremlin with Putin. Zelensky is building up the reservists. The U.S., as I mentioned, is sending more troops to the already 90,000 troops in Europe. It's hard to see an off-ramp. It's hard to see where what role diplomacy can play, what it is that could actually be appealing enough to Putin so he doesn't look like he is responding to unified pressure from NATO, from Europe, and U.S. allies around the world, and in Asia, Japan, Australia. So it's hard to see that off-ramp, and I'm sure Putin is running through his options and his scenarios right now, and surprised by a couple of things that happened, including Nord Stream 2 and the unified reaction from NATO.
Yeah, but will Ukraine just turn over all their weapons and demilitarize?
No, Ukraine will not turn over all their weapons and demilitarize. I am confident. I know that most analysts don't want to say yes or no. I will say no. I am confident about that is not one of the options on the table in terms of the pathway forward.
Right, and that of course is what they are saying today. So what is Russia's intent here? Do you think that they will do they want to occupy or annex all of Ukraine, or is this just going to be focused on the so-called breakaway republics in the east?
So I think Putin basically has three options. One is to stop where he is. He has these independent. He's recognized. Russia has recognized. The parliament has recognized these independent areas and said they're not part of Ukraine. They're independent, and he could stop there, declare victory of some sort. These are now this area that has been in the eastern part of Ukraine under conflict. He has Russian troops are moving in, declare them independent. He's declared them independent and just say, we've achieved our goal. He could push it a little bit further. He could try and make sure that he really does command all of that territory, because about 2/3 of it have not been in separatist control, under separatist control prior to his announcement that these areas were independent. And he could really try and move in, get that land connection between Crimea and Mariupol, and get more control of the Sea of Azov. There are some strategic goals he can get by actually moving in with more force and trying to really take command and control of those areas. And then, of course, there is what I think is really his goal, which is to make sure that at a minimum there's a government in Kyiv that recognizes the hegemonic power of Russia and is really a supplicant to Russia, and or actually reincorporate Ukraine into Russia through force, through war.
Well, and this is what they had with Viktor Yanukovych in charge up until the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014. He was a pro-Russian president. He, not unlike the Belarusian situation, they viewed themselves as a republic that was still part of the Russian sphere, and they basically did what Russia wanted to do. But that's why there was a revolution to overthrow that. But there is a possibility here that part of the so-called negotiations, the diplomatic solution, could be a change in government, even back maybe to Viktor Yanukovych. What do you think?
So right now, diplomacy is really sidelined unless Putin wants to make a move. The summit that Macron was trying to set up, which was actually fragile even to begin with, whether it would even happen, is obviously off the table. Secretary of State Blinken is not meeting with Lavrov. Right now, diplomacy is really not active unless Putin makes the move. There's one thing I think Putin is, I do think he may have been surprised by the fact that President Biden was able to unify NATO and also our allies, as I mentioned, including in Asia, against what he had done, but particularly unify NATO and the G7, which are really critical. Germany, right. France. Britain.
Yeah,
but I was just going to say.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to make one point about the wild card that can actually, I think Putin is sitting and waiting for. And that is domestic reaction. It's domestic reaction in Europe, and it's domestic reaction in the United States. And you heard that with Medvedev's comment about, okay, welcome to the new world where, your gas prices are going to go through the roof. Just trying to play the economic impact of this. How much does inflation, spiral because of this in Europe and in the U.S.? Right now, it is really clear that we are not sending U.S. troops into Ukraine. But what if war does break out, or a kinetic war does break out? And what if he does start making moves in the Baltic, which are NATO countries? And he made it really clear that those former republics are also on his radar as being illegitimate, since they're former Soviet republics and illegitimate as independent nations. So playing the domestic card in democracies, I think, is a card that he is really keeping in his back pocket and watching closely to see how much will public opinion turn against Europe and the U.S. Actually having a firm line in terms of what he's doing in Ukraine or responding to that pressure.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the incremental troops were being sent by the U.S. and NATO, and those troops are going to Poland and the Baltics. So that's that's obviously a different situation. There is a question here, though, in the chat that says that there is a black and white framework around the diplomatic solution, that U.S. and NATO is good and Russia is bad. I'm not sure about the context of that, but the question is whether that is a hindrance in finding a diplomatic solution. It seems like they've been talking about a diplomatic solution, and there's one person that controls this, as you said.
Right, and what I think this is a really clear-cut situation where you had a leader, Putin, of a powerful country with a strong military that has just rolled into, has just declared independent, the independence of areas within a country's boundaries, and said, no, those are independent areas that we recognize as independent. He's just really flagrantly violated international law. And so, in this case, I don't think there's really a gray area as to who is right and who is wrong in terms of the actions he has taken and the threats that he's posing and the buildup of the troops and the forces. But having said that, the door for diplomacy can never be closed. I mean, even if war breaks out, diplomacy is always an open door, and you're always looking for the opportunity, because that's how you avoid conflicts, and that's also how you end conflicts.
Yeah, and so, the U.S. had a strategy here, rightly or wrongly, of pre-announcing that we would not oppose an invasion of Ukraine with troops. We said instead that we were going to deter this through sanctions, and the sanctions that were promised to be swift and severe at the first sign of an incursion into Ukraine. And as of yesterday, at that first sign, the sanctions were on 2 Russian banks, access to Western funding for Russian debt, and sanctions on 3 wealthy Russian individuals. So 2 banks and 3 individuals. Talk about this strategy of pre-announcing that we would not oppose an invasion with troops. Was that the right one? And are these sanctions deterring anything?
Well, it's interesting because announcing that we will not use American troops to enter conflicts, and particularly with Ukraine, since this happened in 2014 as well, prior to the Russians' annexation of Crimea and its disruption of the eastern part of Ukraine in the Donbass area. We make these announcements, in part it is because, and we did the same, President Clinton did the same thing as well, about announcing no U.S. troops in conflict. What's going on here is as I said, this wild card that Putin has in his pocket is that as president of the United States, of a major democracy, you have to take into account domestic public opinion for support, and that conflict of having to actually be speaking to the Americans who tend, I think, for the most part, to actually be and always have leaned more isolationist, just by character, by DNA. So having to deal with that audience. In this case, you also have the issue of NATO. Ukraine is not in NATO, so Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is not applicable. But announcing that you are not going to deploy U.S. troops is obviously a big signal to an aggressor before the conflict actually happens. The tools we're using are, as you mentioned, sanctions is the big tool. There's also defensive support, military support for Ukraine, and there's also economic support to keep the Ukraine government from severely being affected by this aggression. So we have those 3 tools. In terms of the sanctions, I think what I found really interesting, I actually think President Biden is handling this situation that he's been dealt with very well, given the cards that he gets to play with. But in terms of the sanctions, what's interesting, I found really confusing, is why the White House announced sanctions against the two separatist independent areas in Ukraine immediately, which seemed like a very weak response, isolated as it was. In terms of the sanctions that they have announced, yes, you're right. It's two banks, $80 billion in assets. We're the two largest banks in Russia, actually have $750 billion in assets. It's more comprehensive sanctions, in terms of their being able to leverage their sovereign debt and finance it. On the secondary markets, we've already done that on the primary markets. If you look at those, and of course against individuals, if you look at those, on the one hand, they're not going to have an immediate effect in terms of Russia's macro policy. Putin's been planning on this for years. But what I do think is interesting is both of those signal, you've got the two banks. Well, we're looking at banks. And it signals that, your sovereign debt, we're looking at actually really coming down hard in terms of taking you out of the financial markets.
Right. But by pre-announcing that, and you take away a lot of your potential resources, and to say it's sanctions, the Russians have worked around the SWIFT system and built their own system to move money around. They built foreign reserves and hard currency reserves. So it's basically because of the pre-announcement, they were able to then defend against that with everything. And so now, we announced these limited, I would say, sanctions yesterday, and today you have Russian troops and tanks rolling into eastern Ukraine. So it didn't stop anything. It's interesting. Yesterday, a former director of national intelligence, James Clapper, said that he was DNI in the Obama administration, said that he wished that the Obama administration, in retrospect, had done more to punish Russia for invading and annexing Crimea, and that he hopes that we don't make the same mistake this time. How do you react to that?
Well, I think that's absolutely on point. The reaction to Crimea, both before the annexation of Crimea, and again, it was an announcement that the U.S. would not be sending troops from the president. But there was also a significant difference too, I think, in the tone before Crimea in terms of, and I think it actually reflected how the United States was looking at Ukraine, was that this really wasn't the most important challenge we were facing. In terms of priorities, that has flipped. It has flipped on its head in 2022, and President Biden has made it really clear that this is a priority. This is not only President Biden, but NATO, and working with NATO. There was very little, little reaction. It took 5 months to get sanctions from our European allies against Crimea. So on 2014, that's absolutely right. Putin has been working. What's interesting is not just the announcement of sanctions that we have been foreshadowing for the past several weeks or month, but Putin has been working to protect himself from sanctions since 2014. And I would actually go a little bit earlier, because they were also watching what was happening with both China and Russia were watching what was happening with the sanctions against Iran and how far the Europeans were willing to go in terms of that crisis. And so he is actually this alternate SWIFT system that he set up is actually set up with China and building up their reserves, to $630 billion in terms of their reserves is really significant. That doesn't happen overnight. And they also actually had to give up spending and stimulus and growth in terms of their economy in order to have those reserves so that they were ready for this crisis. So Putin has been planning this for a while. And I also think that foreshadows that if he doesn't completely get what he wants from Ukraine, which is, I think, at best, Ukraine is part of Russia, or at least it's a regime that is a supplicant to Russia. If he doesn't get that, this isn't going to be over in a day, a month. It's going to just continue as the 2014 crisis.
So basically what you're saying is the sanctions are not going to work because he's had 7 or 8 years to prepare for them, and he's done workarounds, and he's ready, and he knows what they are. He knows that we're not going to put troops on the ground against him, so he's got free reign to occupy and annex Ukraine. So given that, let's just stipulate that that's what's going to happen. Maybe it's not, and you never give up on diplomacy, as you said. But let's just say he does that, and now he has Ukraine. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, as you said, not just Russia. They are the third largest exporter of grain, period, in the world, and they feed most of Europe. Also, the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 1, run through Ukraine. So the gas and oil that are used to power Europe, Western Europe, comes through Ukraine. So even with Nord Stream 2 now being halted, the certification being halted by Germany, you were really dependent on Ukraine for a lot here. And if that's under total Russian control, doesn't that really put Europe at a different place than the United States in terms of their ability, forget about willingness, but their ability to respond? Because you could, this situation could choke them and starve them. It could cut off their energy and, really change, Western civilization, or at least Western Europe civilization, all with this move.
2 points, Steve. One is that Putin can't be certain, and I think he was surprised by the unity of NATO. So he can't be certain about how NATO may actually respond to this, and whether he provokes or moves so aggressively that NATO does respond militarily to what is happening in Europe. And the reason why I'm saying that is because not only is Ukraine on the chopping block in terms of what Putin has told the Russian people and the world, he also put right in the bullseye the other night. He put right in the bullseye the Baltic countries, and they are members of NATO. So how this spins out and what unexpected or turns it may take, he can't be that certain that NATO won't respond militarily. I think he was surprised, and at Nord Stream 2, what the Germans did, that was his weak link. Germany was his weak link because of Germany's dependence particularly on his gas, but on his oil and gas, and the situation that Germany is in terms of its own energy supplies. Having made the decision to actually get rid of their nuclear power plants, they were relying on Nord Stream 2, which was going to provide 50% of their gas. What Germany did, I think, was probably the biggest surprise of all of the sanctions that happened. And so I think that has him reassessing.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box that, will the general public in most democratic countries of Europe and the Americas just turn a blind eye to this and just let a dictator take over a free country? That's the question. I think what you've said is no, but there are, short of a kinetic war, there are limited actions that can be taken. And so what we're doing is we're you see NATO and the U.S. As part of that, really moving and creating their own Maginot Line here with the Baltics and with Poland, and that's where things are going. So I guess a question would be, what is the prognosis for these NATO states of the Baltics and Poland?
I just want to make a comment about in a democracy, support the public for the policies that we're pursuing in terms of pushing. We, meaning us in Europe, are pursuing in terms of pushing back Putin's aggressiveness against Ukraine. That's where presidential leadership really comes in, and in a democracy, that's where the messaging, the reason why it's important. Why the president's leadership is so important. And if this really is, and I do think it is, an inflection point in terms of European security, the global international world order, what we're willing to accept. And Putin has been very transparent as opposed to, as far as his grand strategy in terms of what he wants to achieve in Europe. It is really important for leaders of democracy, and we saw this obviously during World War II, where you take a very reluctant public and you have to move them because it really is in your national strategic interest to have democracies respond.
Yeah, and that's going to take a lot of work, Lori, because Europe is not really they've been through this a lot of conflicts and a lot of wars over the past 100 years. That's not on the top of their list. And look, the United States is war weary too, with all the decades in the Middle East and so forth. So, that's a pretty heavy lift to get the general public to support anything more than sanctions, don't you think?
Yeah, and what's interesting too is I really do think, having watched some of the video coming out of the Munich Security Conference, and I've actually attended the Munich Security Conference in my former positions, there is genuine disbelief among the leaders of democracies and important players and statesmen in our democracies to actually what's happening. I mean, real disbelief that Europe may be on the precipice of war. It's just it's something that, in terms of the reality of it, that this actually may be what's happening, is just beginning to really, I think, sink in. No matter how much we talk about it, no matter how much we foreshadow what Russia may do, just really sink in that this is really a transformational moment in international relations. In this post-Cold War period, this post-Cold War period is over. European security and how we look at it is going to change. Everything's on the table right now.
Right, and this is a really important point because we know also that the Ukrainians, as recently as this weekend, were saying that Russia was just bluffing. But there are troops and there are tanks moving right now into eastern Ukraine, so it's no longer a bluff. I've got to move to China here, Lori, because there seems to be this new Russia-China axis, two enormous countries with like-minded leaders. Where is this alliance going? Will they begin to take collective actions, and what incremental risk does this pose for the rest of the world?
Well, what's interesting is that the relationship between Putin and Xi has actually been is actually a very strong one, has been developing over the years, and really started around 2013, 2014, when Putin actually annexed Crimea and disrupted and helped build up the separatists and disrupt the eastern portion of Ukraine. But to date, what's really fascinating is that Putin and Xi have met 38 times. And just prior to the pandemic, in November of 2019, Putin actually went to visit China, and they were at this point there was already a very serious. It was the turning point of 2014 that changed Putin's strategy in terms of his economic relationship with China. And China is now Putin's largest trading partner, and that's all happened since 2014. So Putin goes to visit Xi in November of 2019, and Xi actually calls him his best friend. He said that he talked about how they have a global partnership and strategic cooperation. They actually do military exercises together. China had actually started joining some of Russia's military exercises. As I mentioned, it's its biggest trading partner since the annexation of Crimea. But it's more than a relationship of necessity, which was basically Stalin and Mao's relationship during the Cold War. This is actually a relationship where they really like each other, and he's called him my brother, my best friend. Xi has called Putin my brother and my best friend, and they actually have a bonded relationship, personally as well as strategically.
So we all know that China has its own aspirations to move on, and it is interesting that the world's inaction around Crimea sparked this relationship, as you said, at the same time when there was building by China in the Spratlys, and a declaration that the South China Sea was China's sphere of influence, and then you've got the issue of Taiwan. What does this whole new situation mean for Taiwan?
And just to step back, what's so different about this new Cold War period and the Cold War of the 20th century is China. And China is a very powerful, it's the second largest economy. It has been building up its military. This is a very different relationship and partnership between Russia and China in this, Cold War 2.0 versus what happened during the 20th century. And so now turning to Taiwan, how does that fit into it? That is part of the, this part of the reason why China has been so quiet on what's happening in Ukraine. China actually supported Russia a couple of weeks ago in terms of saying that the National Security Council, the UN Security Council meeting in New York didn't need to happen. They have been quiet on condemning Russia for what it did over the past 48 hours. And that gets you right to Taiwan. But what's fascinating is that the Chinese Foreign Ministry actually came out today and said, or was reported today, that they said and made very clear that Taiwan is not Ukraine, that there is both legitimate legal and historical reasons why Taiwan is not Ukraine. And the basis of that is Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It has a seat at the UN, and Taiwan doesn't.
Meaning it's a no-brainer for them to move on Taiwan, and they shouldn't have any kind of world pushback because it's not a sovereign nation in their mind, right? That's what you're saying.
Right. It's not recognized by the United Nations as a sovereign nation. There are about only 15 countries that actually have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And that really all goes back to when we actually recognized China and how that evolved. I mean, the compromise was that the one China policy. And to China, that meant that Taiwan was not a sovereign nation. It was part of China. It was always part of China and should be part of China. And they even called it, this week, they called it a remnant of the Civil War in China, the fact that Taiwan is recognized. And then the U.S. Actually, when it officially recognized China, relations became unofficial at the same time with Taiwan in 1979. But having said that, we are under the Taiwan Relations Act, where we provide for Taiwan's defense. We provide them military equipment for their defense, and we also have our relations are through a private organization, but we have definitely close economic ties with Taiwan as well as military ties.
So Taiwan is not in NATO. But on the other hand, it has NATO-like relationship. We have NATO-like commitments to Taiwan, is what you're saying from a defense standpoint, which scrambles.
I was going to say you need to roll that back a bit. I mean, NATO, it's in the NATO treaty. An attack on one is an attack on all. It is not that clear in terms of our relationship with Taiwan. In the Taiwan Relations Act, we have to be reporting to Congress in terms of threats to Taiwan, and then Congress and the United States would determine how to respond. So it's not NATO, but it's a relationship where Taiwan security is a part of our calculation.
Okay, so we have a lot of business leaders in attendance today. You've got Taiwan. The world depends, and we depend on Taiwan for over half of our semiconductor chips. We have a huge amount of our supply chain, the U.S. supply chain, sitting in China, our manufacturing capability. Wow. I mean, so if this is a new axis, Russia has moved and, called our bluff and basically, said sanctions aren't going to work. You've got the best friend over here and, dependence on each other. You've got Taiwan in the crosshairs. What should business leaders be doing with their supply chain, and how should they be thinking about China?
So it's in terms of what business leaders should be doing. Business leaders hopefully have been already preparing for the crisis that's unfolding in Ukraine right now, and in terms of the disruptions that will happen. But specifically regarding Taiwan and China, I mean, what's interesting here is the CEO of Intel, I believe, said that chips are the new oil of the 21st century. And whereas most of the conflict was over the U.S. making sure that it had access to oil and energy, and we're seeing that in Europe now, oil, gas, energy, chips are actually playing that role in the 21st century calculus. So given that, and this is for supply chains overall, there is a really serious issue in terms of supply chains and chips and what we're going to do with that. How much do we need to bring home? And we are working to bring some of that home. There are negotiations underway right now. There's the legislation in the two innovation and technology bills in the House and Senate that have passed that deal with how do we deal with how do we deal at a policy level with supply chains for chips. But in terms of supply chains in general, we have to be looking. Companies have to be looking at resiliency, at both domestic markets or establishing domestic markets, but also working with allies overseas as alternate markets. Absolutely critical. But the other absolutely critical piece of this too, and I think is probably first and foremost what's going to happen for the latest crisis we're dealing with, is on the cyber side. Preparing for the cybersecurity attacks, the ransomware attacks, which have skyrocketed during COVID-19. You're watching Russia use that in Ukraine during this crisis, as they always do. It's a real tool of their policy. And it may be, in fact, I think it's very predictable that that's going to be part of their response to the sanctions. But I want to make one other point about sanctions and technology, which is that the one sanction that's hanging out there that could really have an impact, just building on this theme of how chips are really the oil of the 21st century, is that actually the sanctions that we have foreshadowed in terms of technology and export controls on technology and microelectronics, anything that uses U.S. IP or components can't be sent to Russia. That's really how we broke the back of what Huawei was doing. President Trump used the foreign direct product rule. And I think that threat to Russia is probably the biggest sanctions threat out there. And China can't help them because China doesn't have, at this time, the ability to actually manufacture the more sophisticated chips.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, that the U.S. administration met with the heads of the largest banks last week, and with intelligence saying that to prepare for an imminent cyber attack, particularly on our financial system, also our energy system. The grid is vulnerable, and so those are the two focuses right now in counter response to our sanctions that we put on, which is, I think, part of the reason why the administration's sanctions have been pretty light so far, because of the that counter threat. But going back to China, the reason that we went to China was due to labor arbitrage. It was cheaper to move your manufacturing to China because labor was so much cheaper, and energy prices were so low that you could ship it then halfway around the world and deliver it net delivered cost in the United States for significantly less than producing it here. Now you've got energy prices skyrocketing. Because of this crisis, you're going to have oil over $100 a barrel. That doesn't look like it's going to happen, ameliorate anytime soon. At the same time, the U.S. has tried to jumpstart in the current administration a move towards a carbon-free society, and move to renewables, which strategically makes sense. But in so doing, they've diminished some of our production capacity on the domestic side. So we can't just simply ramp up, and the pipeline was stopped and so forth. So it's not easy to ramp up supply from the United States. So it's going to cost a heck of a lot more to get our products over here. You've got wages going up in China. You've got the threat. I mean, really, there is an urgency that I'm not sure that the U.S. businesses really understand. There's an urgency to get this back in our supply chain back in our hemisphere. And look, we've got the USMCA, NAFTA. We should think about it as a hemisphere rather than more broadly than just the United States. But I think there's some urgency here that we're starting to hear out of Washington, but nobody, they're not trying to create panic in that. I don't know if you have any additional texture.
Well, the Congress and the administration are definitely aware of the issue, what are the policies you need to put in place, and the Competes Act in the House side that passed, as well as the Innovation Act in the Senate that also has passed and is now in conference. They're trying to deal with some of these supply chain issues. They're trying to deal with supply chains in terms of chips. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the areas where there's actually agreement in the bill in terms of how much money needs to be put into chips development and as an alternative supply source. So there's awareness of it. I think what's happening, to your point, Steve, what's happening in Europe, I think has unfolded much more quickly. We weren't paying attention to this. I mean, it was happening in December, but as a global community, as a country, we weren't paying attention to the Russian troop movements as we were as a government, but not as a nation in terms of what we were talking about. The Russian troop movements on the border, and there was some dismissal of it by leading experts saying that, well, it's happened before. That we've got, from Ukrainians and leading experts, it's happened before, or the real goal is to split NATO. They're really not going to move into Ukraine. And, that has all changed. The administration has been very transparent and has used the intelligence, both in terms of playing mind games with Putin to make him, I think, a little unsettled in terms of who was listening to him where, but also it has helped, I think, businesses know, even though it was fast-paced in terms of you look at time in terms of preparing, let them know that this was serious and the situation was unraveling. But Steve, the conference board did a polling, our C-suite outlook polling, which one of the most fascinating results of that, 1,000 CEOs and C-suite members had answered that. The fact that companies did not, CEOs did not, and members of their C-suite expected another crisis, international global crisis, but didn't think they were prepared to actually deal with it. So,
which just describes the urgency of it. By the way, I did a couple of podcasts with Ed Cox, who is a CED trustee, conference board trustee. You can listen to them on our website. Ed is, of course, Richard Nixon's son-in-law, married to Tricia Nixon Cox. Ed talked about his trips with former President Nixon to China when we opened it up, and a lot of the early negotiations with China and some of the work there. You might want to listen to those two podcasts; they're very interesting. We do have a question here about what's the likelihood that Russia will be banned from the SWIFT network? That of course they have this CIPS SIPs with China, but that's not a great substitute. Is that a big challenge? But they had to assume that they were going to, and they built this separate system, so they knew that they were going to get banned at some point from the SWIFT network. That hasn't happened yet, by the way, but that is in the offing. Is that likely?
So It was actually taken off the table. At least that's what was reported in terms of European response from the SWIFT network. I mean, you're talking about $1.5 trillion in transactions if you kick Russia out. So it's a really significant decision. But having said that, I think depending on what is Putin's next move, it might have been taken off the immediate list, but I think it's definitely still on a longer list. I mean, 80% of Russia's daily foreign exchange transactions are in dollars. 50% of their trade are in dollars. It would be a very serious move, and I think Putin actually will be putting that back on for consideration on the sanctions list, depending on what turn he takes next.
And then, do you think that given the China-Russia collaboration, do you think that could accelerate the passage and funding of the Competes Act and the Innovation and Competition Act, as well as other pending competition policies?
Well, right now, both of those bills have passed the House and Senate, and they're in conference. There are a number of Christmas tree items in terms of immigration reform that were hung on that bill, particularly in the House. And so I think it didn't make it an easy. It's not an easy conference, but I do think what's happening in terms of in Europe and Ukraine adds to the urgency of bringing members together. And so, what Putin has done is the unity that he hoped he could just drive a Mack truck through in Europe and in the U.S. is actually having the opposite effect.
Yeah, it's great. Lori, we're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, thank you so much for this discussion today. The hour has just flown by.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.